Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from Knives called Boy Thursday. So as I have mentioned a number of times, I didn't really go through an angry white boy phase in my teenage years. I jumped pretty much straight from mainstream pop and hip-hop radio to power and symphonic metal. And that meant that I pretty much skipped over all of modern rock radio. You're not hearing power and symphonic metal there. And a big consequence is that I came to the nu metal rap rock scene much later in retrospect, in like my early 20s in comparison with so many others my age. It was not really a part of my formative musical evolution. And I'm kind of grateful for that, because upon revisitation, that with rare exception, a lot of rap rock tends to be really bad, especially in the late 90s, the closer it crept to the gut-churning angst of nu metal or the overblown and frequently disgusting machismo of acts like Limp Bizkit. Now, this was music that rarely bothered to be tuneful or driven by consistent grooves or strong musicality. That's where you get to the often atrocious lyrics. It just was not very good at all. Now, that's not saying I didn't find stuff I liked. I'd always been a big fan of the Beastie Boys from more of a hip-hop vein, and when you follow it with solid work like the funk inspiration by the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Faith No More, Rage Against the Machine, and more of the punk side, there is a subset of this music I can get behind and support, especially leaning more towards that punk era. And there's part of me that feels that this genre could even sustain a comeback in the modern era, potentially even driven from hip-hop instead of mainstream rock, which really isn't doing much of anything right now. Acts like Doomtree and Run the Jewels are only getting production that's more aggressive and abrasive, and that's not even touching on Death Grips. And that's where you touch on mainstream acts like Eminem, who I would put money on pursuing more of a rap rock direction, especially if he drops a record in a year or so, and especially if he goes more political. It seems like a natural outburst for him, and he already made Berserk on the Marshall Mathers LP too. And so into all that comes Knives, a new band fronted by LA rapper Jay Medeiros, who you might know from his association with Ruckus Records and Talib Kweli, or his work with the Percussions in the early 2000s. Medeiros has actually been active since the late 90s, and pretty darn prolific at that. So in addition to a planned debut from an electronic hip-hop duo Alt-A later this year, he's been pushing a rap-rock band that's more inspired by punk and post-hardcore called Knives. In the aftermath of covering POS and not really getting the political material for which I was hoping, I thought this could scratch the itch and it could be a good step in the right direction. Was I right? Well, okay. This is an interesting case, and something I don't really encounter all that often. Since this was, yes, indeed, a Patreon request, we have yet another case where the record requested is pretty far from bad. In fact, it's sort of debut that I can see this getting a fan base really fast. It's solid work, but it's also outside of genres that I normally like and peruse. And this is going beyond just rap rock. No, what Boy Thursday reminds me of much more is hardcore punk and post-hardcore, at least what I've been exposed of. Two subgenres that I've never really had the time or inclination to really explore or analyze, which means that any sort of analysis I'm going to try to present might have some holes in it, fair warning. In other words, while I do consider this kind of intriguing as a project, I can definitely imagine people more familiar with the subgenres liking this a lot more than I do, because while I think it is good, it's also not really my thing. So let's start off with the instrumentation and production, and really, the rap rock post-hardcore intersection does make for a peculiar blend of style. In some cases, it's more straightforward towards hardcore, and the galloping stutter of the beat and drums against the sharper riffs on Sucker Punch, or the buzzy, grinding muscle of the title track, or the simply cacophonous drum work that drives Wildin' Inside. I'll be with this weird major key melodic shift on the bridge that I'm not sure works, but it's kind of interesting. But sometimes the instrumentation can take very different turns that opt for a little bit more complexity. Take the opener, Property, which features a very subdued, falsetto-driven hook that in a bizarre way kind of reminds me of a Cynic song with a progressive drum breakdown, but with the squealing layers of guitar playing off some gurgling synths against Jay Medeiros' sharper bars. It was a genre blend that kind of seemed to work. It gets slightly less so in a noisy Queens of the Stone Age-esque melodic riff that plays off the fizzy bubble of synth and bass on fine print that fades into this bridge of fuzzed out distortion, but again, I can kind of see the appeal of this if I like this genre more. I think if I were to highlight an element that consistently doesn't work for me, it would come in some of the gurgling, buzzy synth tones that show up on songs like the gurgling, frenetic blur of Figurehead Catacombs, or the buzzy waves of the Mike Muir collaboration X's and O's, or the chiptune tones that seem to drown out the melody on the verses of Give Me Air, or that blocky key shifts on Exit that don't quite blend with the fuzzier, borderline tremolo rattles of guitar that had some potential. And yet, when when you get tracks that comes together like on the bridge of the closer of Holy Toast, which probably features one of the most instantly recognizable hooks on this project, might be my favorite song here. That synth actually kind of worked for that song. And yet, while I can describe most of the sounds and tones on these 10 tracks, which very quickly can get exhausting considering that unlike a lot of hardcore punk, these tracks typically hit the 3-minute mark, this album does feel a little longer than it might be. I have a hard time putting much of a value judgment on how much of these songs work within these genres in that context. It's noisy, it's abrasive, the guitar and drum progressions are certainly more interesting and intricate than I would have otherwise expected going in, certainly in comparison with most hardcore punk, and yet I wouldn't say I was wild about some of these hooks or how some of the tones were blended. Maybe I was expecting a little bit more muscle on the low end. The bass can definitely feel neglected at some points. Or maybe I was expecting the tones to be a little bit grittier or maybe better blended outside of the synth. They're trying to glue it all together. But there are points where I feel like the whirling, furious energy of it all doesn't quite coalesce beyond explosive statements on songs like the title track or X's and O's, much less actual choruses or hooks. I have to think Jay Medeiros has to take some of the blame for this. I'm not going to deny that this guy can flow really well with the sort of intensity and speed to keep up with a lot of his beats, and that's saying something. And he's clearly giving this his all, but I'm also not really wild about his vocal tone. He reminds me a fair bit of Zach De La Rocha co-opting a bunch of Run the Jewels flows, and the comparison can be really stark, especially in the more hip-hop inspired songs. But De La Rocha also had a certain level of howling grit and assertive weight and charisma that Medeiros doesn't quite have to the same extent in his vocal tone in order to match that. They make him come across a little bit more nasal, not always having the weight to match his more hardcore instrumentation. And again, this could be more common and accepted in hardcore punk. If it is, I'll take your word for it, but I wasn't really blown away by a lot of his vocals here. Passionate to be sure, but didn't really work for me. And yeah, the frustrating thing is that when it comes to the actual content, I think Medeiros is a pretty solid political rapper. The extended slavery metaphors on property, the anti-corporate rage of Wild 'N Inside and Fine Print, the voice of the proletariat revolution spitting on Figurehead Catacombs, and especially the blunt but utterly effective Give Me Air, which speaks about systemic police brutality and militarization, and the underlying insecurity that drives so much of it. And keep in mind that he's got real insight to back up a lot of these points, from the scapegoating of urban stereotypes and population to feed back into the toxic cultural cycle of X's and O's, to the frustrated musings at the entrenchment of authoritarian religion on Holy Toast within American culture, often commercialized and trivialized to push some really horrible messages the more you think about it. I will say that songs like the title track can be a tad tough to really unpack, as it seems like that's about exploitation of racial stereotypes in cinema, but the choices of words and imagery are often so stark and so well presented that I almost wish I liked the music more in order to support the explosive ideas behind this guy. Hell, if I go by my 3 Ps of good political art, it's got the precision, it certainly has the power, and the populism, well, it's funny, because when you decode the songs, they definitely do have that strong populist streak in order to inspire the people, but the fact that you do have to decode a fair few of these just to pull out the underlying ideas behind that rhetoric does kind of put a damper on it, if only a very slight one. But again, I feel a little bit out of my depth here, because this sound and style of music is just not really often in my wheelhouse. But I get the feeling if I did like rap rock in the vein of the more hardcore side of Rage Against the Machine, I would like this a fair bit. I do wish the hooks and the grooves were a little bit stronger, and I'm not really sold on Jay Medeiros as a frontman when it comes to some of his delivery. But overall, I'm giving this a very strong 6 out of 10, and yet if you're more of a fan of hardcore or post-hardcore or rap rock, definitely give this a listen. It's explosive, it's riotous, it's righteous angry, and it's got a lot to say if you're willing to decode it, cutting in a way that lives up to the name. Definitely check this out. It's worth it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. I'm not sure how many of you guys will have heard this project, given that it was released on Bandcamp, but the poll's up there if you're interested and you want to rate it. And if you actually want to buy the album, the link is in the description below. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Anything else I might be able to do, and if you guys want to get more involved in my schedule, the link to my Patreon is right here, where 3 times a week or more, you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher Patreon contributors, you guys get to add records to my schedule. More details right there, but until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.